most people in this country have some sort of faith background. How can you, as a practitioner, ignore a huge component of someone's life when you are trying to help them? You need to think about the whole person and all aspects of who they are.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. My guest today is Dr. Nii Addy, professor at Yale, expert in the neurobiology of addiction, a man of faith who wants his research to bring health to people who suffer addiction and to help their families. Today, I'm glad to welcome my guest, Dr. Nii Addy, who works for the Yale School of Medicine, and he's the Albert E. Kent Professor of Psychology. Actually, associate, but who cares? I mean, associate's better than assistant, and he's an associate professor of cellular and molecular biology, and he has other titles, but I'm going to say he's a neuroscientist, he's a researcher, he's a teacher, he's a mental health advocate, and his specialty is addictions, all kinds of addictions. And so he looks at that and the way in which addictions shape the brain, and the brain is shaped by addiction. And so he's very helpful to a lot of people. He's also got a very interesting podcast, which I want to recommend to you, called The Addy Hour, A-D-D-Y, The Addy Hour. And he interviews people about mental health issues. And it's just a sweet-spirited, informational podcast that I recommend to our listeners. Great to have you. What did I miss? What do you need to correct? Or do you want to add something about yourself?
I think you summed it up well, maybe even better than I do, because I sometimes struggle with how to encapsulate all the different things that I seem to have gotten my hands in as of late.
Yeah. Talented people get their hands in a variety of areas, and then there's sort of a penumbra, right? So you're not a clinician, but you can help people with clinical matters. You probably get in a lot of conversations with people about substance abuse. So one of your focal points is neurobiological mechanisms of complex behavior, and certainly that includes maladaptive behavior, and that includes substance addiction. So I'm going to ask you to do something. Would you explain, pretend your children, we just talked a little bit before we got started, are 12 and 17, and a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old can be very bright. And how would you explain this to an attentive, how would you explain what you do to a 10, 11, 12-year-old or a 16 or 17-year-old? If you can do that, you can probably reach my audience, right? So how would you describe it?
Oh, and this will be, I'll say I've cheated in the sense that I've had some practice explaining this to them and to others as well. So this won't be a first-time attempt for me. But a lot of the times I'll just say, well, what we really are doing is trying to understand what happens in the brain that allows us to behave in certain ways. Okay. So think about all the things that we do as human beings in our behaviors, how we interact, how we socialize, how we go about our daily activities. And then when we're talking about mental health, thinking about behaviors associated with good mental health or mental health challenges. So if we think about, behaviors that we would say, oh, someone's coping really well in a stressful situation, and their brain actually allowed that to happen. Or if someone had a really traumatic or difficult experience, how that affect their brains and how that also affected their behavior. So in a nutshell, I would say, really just what does the brain do to actually allow us to behave and to interact with the world around us?
Yeah, so you mentioned traumatic events, and this wasn't in my script, but I have somebody in my life who grew up in a situation that included starvation. Not personal, but there was a lot of starvation where he lived, where he grew up as a child. And when he would see a big meal, he would binge. He would just eat and eat and eat. And it made people upset, but maybe if they'd been a little more patient to realize this is a man who saw starvation, it was maladaptive. Is that an accurate picture of what the kind of thing you're talking about?
Definitely. And I would say that, that area that you've talked about is one that we're learning a lot more about too. So people will throw around the word, the gut-brain axis. And basically what that encapsulates is there's actually communication between the gut and the brain. So someone who's gone through starvation, that can have effects on their brain and how they behave in certain situations. Also the other way around is someone that has had experience where they haven't had enough food, and then they begin to see that large amounts of food just because of what they've gone through and what effects that has on their brain will also affect their behavior. That's something that definitely comes out when we talk about addiction as well, and something we may loop back to in this conversation. So.
Yeah, we might. So I do want to focus on addictions because that's your field, and a lot of people wrestle with that. Probably every single person that's going to listen to this podcast has a friend or a family member who's addicted. And I want to give you a chance to say a few basic things that you would if you had 3 minutes, standing in line somewhere and they said, hey, I know you're the addiction expert. What would you say to them? What would you say if you had 3 minutes to just get somebody, start to orient someone to their friend or their dad or their coworker who's addicted to something?
Yeah, so I would say that our focus is really, again, understanding what happens in the brain that allows those addictive behaviors to emerge in the first place, and also trying to see if there are ways that we can change our brains to actually help people move through that and get to a place of recovery and healing. And a lot of people are on recovery journeys. So some of that is just thinking first step. When people take substances, it's always good to remember those are chemicals that actually interact with our brains, and that's why people have a high or a buzz, because of how those chemicals are acting in our brain, tapping into things that we already have in place for reward and pleasure. So a lot of those things are also important for how we think about how we respond to our favorite food. For instance, it taps into the same brain circuitry. So that's one level. But then when we think about addictive behaviors, maybe if someone is having a craving or they're using a substance to excess instead of, taking care of their family or job responsibilities, that also is the brain being affected by those substances and causing some changes in their behavior. But of course, that also interacts with all other aspects of our lives as well. So I would tell the person a lot of what we're trying to do is understand what effects do the drugs and substances have in the first place, what long-term effects they do, and how do those actually contribute to all the symptoms that we associate with addiction. And then how can we actually change those, whether that's through a medication or through psychological interventions or through prayer or spiritual practice. All those things also have effects on the brain. So we're also trying to understand how those things affect the brain to get people to be able to have opportunities to move to a place of healing.
That was a great 3-minute summary, and there's so many questions I want to ask you. But let me start with this. Do I understand you correctly when I hear you describe changes in the brain? We say rewiring, of course, that's a metaphor. The brain is not wires, but there are a lot of connections with electrical impulses. So we admire somebody who can maybe operate on a balance beam, and do flips and so forth. And their body has been slowly adapted or formed by that, right? That you could never do that without months, years of training. And, there are other things people do that are just marvelous, like throwing a javelin or pole vaulting or even typing really fast or playing a piano. So is addictive behavior kind of like that? I mean, we're constantly shaping our brain, which is plastic, and it can be good or bad.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
I think it's a really good example, especially because you brought in the sports component. Because the nice thing about the sports component, it's a merger of both sometimes quote unquote natural talent and the practice. Because you could take 10 people, they could all practice that balance beam the same amount of time. Not all 10 of them are going to come out the same way. Some of them might never get it just because of how they were quote unquote wired. Some might have more of a natural talent. Also, if you took someone who is 5'2" versus someone who's 7'2", they probably have a different capabilities for how well they can stay on that narrow beam.
Right.
So it's the same thing with drug use as well. So I mean, part of it, of course, with drug use, you have to use something in the first place before you can become addicted to that. But everybody starts at a different baseline. There may be individuals who can drink casually and that will have no long-term consequences. They can drink wine at dinner and not lead into a different state. There may be some people, because of either family history or because of their biology and genetics, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that they may be more susceptible. So someone in that instance may be more likely to do behaviors that would be associated with alcoholism. And of course, the more alcohol somebody consumes, that's also going to have effects on the brain. So it's going to feed back. In the same way, if you have a gymnast who has practiced that sport for 20 years, that's going to be very different than someone who's going on the beam for the first time.
Right.
And so both of those things all play. So I think the example you picked was outstanding in that sense.
Well, I'm glad that I'm co-laboring with you here.
Yes.
So I want to get personal for a second. So when I knew I would talk to you, I think of one of my best friends who, just a dear, dear man. And I'm allowed to say this. I'm not going to say his name, of course, but he permits me to talk. Kind and godly and self-sacrificial and serves other people, but there's a propensity for alcohol abuse in his family, and he would call himself an alcoholic in the sense that, not that he's drinking right now, but that's part of his life, and he has slipped back into it in times of extreme stress. So would it be accurate to say there's a propensity, there's a past, and maybe he learned I relax or I handle stress through alcohol, and that's why I revert to it? Is that one of the mechanisms for people who fall back into addiction after seemingly breaking from it?
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful example that you've given as well, especially because you tied in the stress component. And that often is a way that people will cope in certain situations. We've definitely seen that during the pandemic as well, as there's been more alcohol use, more substance use. And so part of that, again, is as a coping mechanism, and it gets back to this idea of adaptive versus maladaptive behavior. So I think many people, and this, this can vary in terms of theological practices and denominations, but in terms of people having a glass of wine with dinner, a lot of people would say that after a stressful day, that might just be an adaptive, relaxing, calming. You have a nice meal, you have a glass of wine. A lot of people would say there's no problem with that.
Yeah, by the way, this is a Presbyterian podcast, and we think wine with a meal is fine.
Okay.
There are a few exceptions, but you're not offending me, or I don't think you're going to offend many of our listeners. We might even say beer is permissible. It's conceivable.
You could even break it out even broader than that. So
even
I like
broader,
that.
Even broader. All right,
I
go
appreciate
ahead.
that context.
Yeah,
I appreciate definitely helpful. At the same time, I would say many people might say that if any of us grabbed a bottle of a can of beer or a bottle of wine every time we felt stressed and had that next to us all the time, a lot of us would say that's maladaptive, especially if we think about excessive alcohol use throughout the day. So I put that in extremes, but that's one example to say that something can be fine in one circumstance, but be maladaptive when it's used to excess, and if it interrupts with people's daily lives and their general practices. So I think the example you gave is key, but some of it also, again, is how people respond to stress. And the more stress people have, the more likely they are to turn to certain substances and things like that. This is probably, I won't take this too far, maybe a bigger topic than we might discuss here, but especially comes up when we think about different societies and different communities within the U.S., especially those which are underprivileged or socioeconomically deprived for a whole host of different reasons. It's much more likely that people in those very stressful situations will use substances. And I think it's important for us to also think about the environment that people are in when we're trying to reach them without just judging outright.
Yeah, thanks for that. And of course, different cultures have different approaches to stress.
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to a Russians are big drinkers. And so we shouldn't be surprised if a Russian drinks too much. And you're saying, okay, let's apply that to underprivileged communities and not think of everybody as having an identical approach to these matters. So, obviously somebody's well off can misuse legal but high-end medications, and it looks perfectly fine, and we don't scorn them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good example.
So let me go in a slightly different direction. It may actually be on one of your podcasts that I heard this, so you can take credit, or maybe I read it somewhere recently. But one of the things I noticed about the break with addiction literature is that trying over and over again is one of the most important things. So I saw somewhere, maybe it was you, because I listened to your podcast, that the number one predictor of success at breaking with nicotine addiction, smoking too much, is trying and failing and just trying again and again and again. Is that accurate for your research purposes, that trying again, it kind of connects to your let's not heap shame on anybody. Let's encourage them. Let's not crush them for failing. Let's encourage them to try again.
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. I've said that in multiple contexts, so I don't actually know if it was on the podcast. It may have been. Right. But nicotine is one of the things that we do study in the lab as well. And you're exactly right. That is one of the number one predictors. So the way you've tied that in, if there's so much stigma and we dismiss someone for failing once, that is antithetical to the whole process, because we basically just invalidated the research that shows that the multiple attempts are actually going to be that much better. I'd say the other thing that also I've heard, so I've also interviewed some addiction psychiatrists on the podcast as well, especially those who have a faith background, many who are Christians, who also emphasize the recovery journey. So Dr. Myra Mathis actually talked about that and working with someone who was moving through alcohol use disorder, saying that she was rejoicing with this person for going a specific amount of time and having a new record where they hadn't used for a while and even used less than they typically would. Instead of saying, oh, I'm so disappointed in you and that you failed again. But really thinking about the recovery journey and the process and not being solely focused on abstinence from day one as the only goal. And so I thought that was a really helpful perspective as well that ties into your nicotine example.
Yeah, that's a terrific example. Because it also applies to things like food and overeating, right? Because what good does it do to just yell at somebody? And then they're ashamed, and then they start hiding food. And again, I'm sure everybody who knows that someone who's had a substance problem knows that they hide when they break. Usually, they try to hide anyway and make it obscure. So, and then, of course, when they're hiding, if they hide effectively, they're not going to get any help.
Yeah.
And they're going to stay there. And people are going to wonder what happened to them, and eventually somebody will, discern what the problem is.
Yeah, and that encouragement, as you mentioned, just goes a long way. So just to throw out one more story. So in some of the classes that I teach, this is for the medical students, first-year medical students. Oftentimes I'll present the biology of craving and relapse and things like that. And then oftentimes we'll have one of our psychiatry colleagues actually bring someone who they're currently who's currently in treatment with them, so one of their patients, to speak to the class. That does a few things because those individuals are on a recovery journey and feel very empowered to know that what they're doing is actually helping the students have an understanding. But one of the things that one of those individuals shared was really helpful in terms of context. So he said that, he was really trying to get to a better place of using less and abstaining, but he wanted the students to get a grasp of craving. So he asked them to imagine their favorite food, the thing that they would love to have. He said to take that craving and multiply it or intensify it by 1,000.
Okay.
He said that was the intensity with which he would crave substances even while he was in that process. So just to give the students that much more of a perspective of, because, a lot of times people might say, oh, that person's weak, or they're not having enough faith, or they're not strong-willed enough. But to really give the students a sense of how much and how intense that craving is. And many of us often give into our craving for that favorite food. So I think it was helpful to just put it in that context. So I just wanted
we could ask, can you also add hunger to it? I mean, let's say it's your favorite food and you haven't eaten for 24 hours. Because the person with a substance desire hasn't, quote unquote, eaten for some period of time.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a physiological component, not just a desire.
Exactly.
You've mentioned prayer a couple times, and you do on your podcast. Of course, we share the same faith. Would you just elaborate a little bit? I went to Yale too. It's not the kind of place that hates religion by any means, but it's not a Christian organization. I mean, it was founded that way 300 years ago, but that's long gone. Number one, what is the role of prayer, and how? Just maybe walk us through how resonates in your research community when you say prayer is a component here of the path forward. That's two questions.
Yep, I'll take both. So the first, the way it relates, that's an interesting conversation that a lot of people are having. So there has been research that's done around prayer itself too, specifically, and I'm forgetting the name of the exact institute at Duke University, where they've actually tied in theology with some of the mental health components. That research is, in a sense, all over the place. I'm saying that as a researcher because sometimes you see, and this is just also general health, you see people who are prayed over who don't know they're being prayed over when they're going through a health ailment or in the hospital. Sometimes it's effective, they get better. Sometimes there's no effect. Sometimes it's worse. So from a purely research perspective, that can be confusing. But there are a lot of other, evidences that actually point to the power of prayer and just being in community, in the faith community, as you're navigating through those things as well. And of course, not surprisingly, the biology backs up what we see in scripture in terms of the importance of having those components.
Right.
But there is also some really striking research that does point to the power of prayer in general. So there was a study that was looking at how people respond to pain. And looking both at the threshold that they had to that pain and also how their brains responded. And so they looked at people who didn't have any prayer life per se, people who meditated, and people who prayed to a higher being. It turns out as you go along that spectrum, those who prayed to a higher being, their brains actually responded differentially to pain. So the areas in the front of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, which can kind of regulate our emotions and our pain response, was more active in those individuals. And they actually also had a higher threshold. So they also physically didn't respond to the pain as much. And that was the highest for those who prayed to a higher being. So that's a nice intersection of some of the principles where you can actually see the biology playing that out as well. So there's evidence.
That's demonstrated. That's repeatable, and you don't have to say, I just believe this. You can offer people evidence. That's terrific.
Yeah. So to your second question, I think people are more respectful of that perception or that approach now. I would say a lot of that has had to do with the pandemic. in which people are just more, well, there's multiple pieces there, and maybe you can speak to this as someone who is in the pastorate more so than me. But I think with all the uncertainty and anxiety that came with the pandemic, the lack of control, there were a lot more people who were asking questions about, oh, maybe I'm not as in control as I thought I was. And maybe I shouldn't be so dismissive of people who seem to be grounded in a faith that's helping them walk through this. So I think that was one piece of it, to not be dismissive. But I think people are also just more open to aspects of the whole person. So I know I'm referencing the podcast again, but Dr. Charles DK is a psychiatrist, also a person of faith, who came on the podcast and was sharing evidence that most people in this country have some sort of faith background. While as for years, most people, at least a majority in mental health practitioners, did not. So there was a mismatch, but he was basically saying, how can you as a practitioner ignore a huge component of someone's life when you are trying to help them? You need to think about the whole person,
Right.
all aspects of who they are. So that has definitely come into play as well.
Which kind of resonates with the saying we use now more and more. Yeah, I want to be able to bring my whole self to this exercise, entity, community, workplace, whatever.
Yeah.
And hey, my whole self includes a variety of things, but one of them is, of course, faith. I'm just going to give you a personal anecdote. So obviously, I'm mostly a professor, but I've been a pastor a lot too. And so we pray over people. I've prayed over people many, many times. And sometimes people have gotten better dramatically, immediately. Not often, but it does happen. And then other times people who are told, basically you're going to die or you're never going to walk again, don't die. And they do walk again. 3 months later, they're strolling into a meeting. And you were told you never walk again. But other times, the one I remember the most is a friend of mine who had cancer 3 times and finally succumbed. He was a mentor of mine. He was older than me. But the second time he got cancer, we were together. And I gathered a group of people, friends and colleagues, and we prayed over him. And he later told me that that was the single most encouraging thing that had ever happened to him, because he was so low and he wasn't able to say it because, I've got cancer again. And it allowed him to function. I mean, nobody noticed he was still working. We were colleagues. We worked together. Nobody noticed a drop-off in function. And it was tremendously empowering for him just to have people pray over him. Even though he didn't, get better the next day. It was a year till he got better.
Wow.
That's
powerful.
I know I didn't give that wasn't the question. You
That's
just said,
fine,
wow.
but I mean, yeah, things are, one, just to be completely blunt and honest, I feel like it's the power of God at work when you see those immediate miraculous healings.
Yes.
But sometimes that also happens. We could debate about, is that happening through the biology? Is that happening through a supernatural intervention? But even as you were sharing the story about your friend, I'm also thinking about just the power of being in community and having those words prayed over you, and some of the evidence for what happens when people are in community. The oxytocin, which is a chemical that's released in our brain that helps us bond. It actually goes all the way back to birth. It's first released when the mother gives birth, and then also in that child rearing process creates those bonds between mother and child. But it's also important for how we identify with each other. Something about God working through that as well to bring that hope, as you described so eloquently, the hope that he, maybe not, I don't know if you used the word hope, but it seemed like the hope that he had in hearing his friends pray over him and how that helped him navigate through as well.
We need to take a quick break. After the break, Dr. Addy will offer practical counsel on the way we can be helpful and friends of people who face addiction.
The Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals is a coalition of believers who hold the historic creeds and confessions of the Reformed faith and proclaim biblical doctrine in order to foster a Reformed awakening in today's church. What all that means is we care about the church, we care about truth, and work hard to preserve and advance it every day. Connect with our broadcast, podcast, publishing, internet, and event platforms at workingwithdan.org. Thank you for your prayerful and financial support of the Alliance.
So let me take a little bit of a 45-degree angle turn. One of the things that you and to some extent I and everybody deals with is that people who struggle with addictions often are full of self-recrimination. And if you start saying disease model talk to them, they'll say, hey, this is not a disease. It's not like cancer. Nobody took their first step toward cancer. I chose to try cocaine or marijuana or alcohol, whatever it might, oxys of one kind to use, since we mentioned the good oxy. There's the bad oxy, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, I chose this, and I did it on a lark. I did it because my friends told me it'd be awesome, and I chose it. Don't tell me it's a disease. What would you say to someone who is self-critical in that way, and rejects the disease model that is common? What would you say?
Yeah, so I actually answer it with a story. So
Okay.
a few years back, I did an event at a public library my wife actually organized called the STEM Coffee Hour. And mine was on the neuroscience of addiction. And so we had individuals who came to that who were part of a recovery house. So they were on their recovery journeys. And they said this exact thing when they walked in. This isn't a disease. I did it to myself. And so, I validated that, again, you do have to use in order to become addicted to something. But as I went through and kind of talked about the long-term or the effects of long-term use on the brain, a lot of them said, okay, now I have a better understanding of what this substance has done to my brain, how it's changed my brain. And not to say that's a hopeless situation, but that their brain was moving in a different direction, maybe in a new normal. And so we really just had a dialogue back and forth. I talked about the neuroscience. They talked about their experiences with certain medications, ones that were helpful, ones that they thought had too many side effects, ones that made them feel like they were using something else instead of the substance. So I think by the end, there was more of an understanding that, okay, it's a little bit of both. They're using initially, but there are long-term effects. In the same way that we might also talk about that with hypertension or diabetes. It's not all the behavior, but you can't ignore the behavior too. If I never exercise a day in my life and I have heart issues, some people are going to say you might need to change your lifestyle. That might be impacting what's happening to your heart. So there's that aspect that comes into play too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, most people listen to this podcast, but I'm looking at you and you look like you work out. So I'm
trying.
just well, maybe not, we don't get to the gym
not
as often
much as I should,
as we would like when we have kids of a certain age and our careers going well. But, I'm guessing you just put on your sneakers and run out the door and go running for a while from time to time. So I want to ask you the question that may be just this blunt. You might have hit it already. What would you say to somebody who does have a dear friend or a family member who's really struggling with addiction, including might be physiological sides and behavioral sides and emotionally, shame and so forth? What would your starting point be? You're not going to solve it. You're eating hamburgers at the grill and they say, just give me a clue, friend. Give me a couple French fries to get me started on understanding my person whom I love who's in my life.
Yeah. Well, the first place I'd probably start, and this is, I think, the mental health advocacy coming out, and maybe just, the exposure I've had to clinical psychology is just validating how difficult that is for individuals who are trying to walk that out with family members or friends, because it does, even for those individuals, take an emotional toll. So I want to support them there and to say that it's not easy, and to have them know that they have support in walking through that. But the other thing I would say is just knowing that there are effective treatments that can help people through that, and to make sure that they feel like they can let that family member or friend know that they're there for them. And not so much as pushing them into something, a certain treatment, because that can actually sometimes not go as you would want, or the person might be more defensive or not open to it, but to really encourage them to let that person know that they're there for them. But then to also let them know about the biology. So a lot of the work that we do is actually in rats and mice. As people may know, those are animals that we often are able to utilize in our experience, because they show a lot of behaviors that people do as well. They'll actually take substances that people will actually show relapse.
They get hooked on nicotine.
Nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin. And they also can go through periods of relapse.
The
interesting thing is, as I sometimes talk about that work in the rodents, I've had people who've told me that hearing the talk about the rats actually gave them more insight into how their loved one was acting in a certain way. So then the question is always, are we just rats, complicated rats? I would say no, but there are enough similarities that can help us understand.
It's illuminating. Right.
And so that also comes into play as well, and saying, okay, well, there are things that we can understand about the biology, but that'll actually just point people to resources. So National Alliance on Mental Illness is a great one, NAMI, because they have a lot of different groups, support groups, that just to help people navigate, because it's a different situation. Not everybody can relate or understand what it's like to have a loved one go through that. So to be in a room with others who are also going through that, again, it's that community piece. And that's huge in helping people just talk about the struggles and challenges and equip each other to move forward.
Well, then I think as I get into this and I learn more slowly over the years, I notice that there's a sort of a cluster of paradigms. There's not one way it goes, right? So, I know people who smoke one cigarette a year just to show they can do it. And I faintly know somebody who's taken heroin, like 5 times in their life, and they're like, it was kind of interesting, but there's no way I'm going to go back. And, we think of heroin as absolutely addictive. Let me go to a different direction. So I'm underscoring your point that a community won't be identical, but if there's 14 people, 1 or 2 of them or 3 of them may be close enough to you that it'll be illuminating. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah.
But this may be a little bit of field, but, we live in an age of anxiety, you said, and that's certainly true. How can we be anxious in one of the most prosperous countries that's ever existed? I mean, we don't have food scarcity much, and we may lack good food in certain places, and people may choose to eat bad food, or, there are food deserts, as we know, in our country. But, people aren't starving, and we're doing pretty well. Why are we anxious? Aren't we just a bunch of softies? Is that our problem, Nii, or is there something else going on there?
So I'm smiling because it's such a succinct but big question at the same time. So one, I would say that the anxiety itself is not tied to prosperity. Some would even argue, and I'd have to go back and look at the data, that some of the rates of anxiety and depression potentially are higher the more quote unquote prosperous you are. And I know many people who have traveled to different parts of the world who just say that there's just a different sense of wholeness and contentment that is in those places compared to the quote unquote healthier, prosperous places in the world. So that's one piece. And I think some of it just comes with the expectations that we put on ourselves and the stresses. So we talked about stress at the beginning as well. So being involved in the church community, and interacting with folks in the New York City area, that's something that has come up a lot as, a lot of individuals who are in very high stress, intense, working all the time types of environments that are not healthy for us, but maybe financially rewarding.
Yeah. They have all the food they want, but they're on the achievement treadmill trying to get to the top, which is very destructive. And we're smiling at each other. I know that I didn't really think that we're so wealthy that we should be happy all the time. I don't believe that for a second, but thanks for that comment. So we're going to go to lightning round. Is that okay?
Yep.
Lightning round means you got to answer not quite lightning, but maybe a fast-moving river. We're trying to 60 seconds or less. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Question number 1. What would you like to have achieved 5 years from now?
So lofty goal, I would say, to really help us as a nation reshape how we think about and approach mental health.
Yeah.
To not be dismissive of any one particular approach, but really think about it in a holistic way. That includes the science, includes psychology, psychiatry, spiritual practice, faith, and really integrating those and wrestling and saying, okay, there's probably some level at which each of us feel uncomfortable, to be able to move past that and to say, okay, that's something that I need to be comfortable with, and either help myself or influence how others think about mental health.
Yeah, good. I like it. Thank you. Number 2, what is the best advice you have ever received?
You can't do everything at once. That was from my father.
Okay.
I don't know if I've learned, maybe I haven't learned it yet, but it's still good advice.
Well, you can maybe do 4 things at once, but you can't do everything at once. Okay. If you could be remembered for any contribution, which kind of overlaps with 5 years from now, but you're young-ish. If you could be remembered for any contribution, what would it be 50 years from now?
Wow. So I think it would be some combination of having impact in individual lives, but also having impact across a larger scale of society. Having people be empowered to kind of to move through their lives in a more wholesome way, but then also to empower others, especially around the realm of mental health and neuroscience.
So just referring back to your podcast, which again, I recommend, the Addy Hour, the theme that I thought was helpful to me and surely to a lot of other people is this idea of, you're saying empowerment, but you also have the other side, and that is not stigmatizing, not devaluing individuals or groups, and encouraging people to keep on trying instead of viewing themselves or viewing other people as a failure. Oh, he's off the wagon again. Well, he's getting on the wagon again. Could also be another approach. I hear that from you a lot, it seems. I love it. if I can just say so.
I appreciate that.
If logistics were no object, what would you do for the next year?
So I think research-wise, I would probably have a much larger research enterprise and just think about lots of different substances. Polysubstance use is a thing that comes up. But a lot of things that we're looking at relate to relapse. We've only focused on a few substances like cocaine and nicotine, but my sense is that these things may be really applicable across the board. So if we could somehow scale up and study a lot of different substances that could bring a lot of help to different people and move that into clinical practice effectively and quickly, that never happens in a year, but that would be my dream.
So you wouldn't take your family to New Zealand and just hike in the mountains all the time, huh?
Maybe do that as well at the same time while the research was ongoing.
Well, we talked about the gut and the brain. I'm just going to sneak it in there. My students mock me because I put donuts when I talk about addiction and ethics, I put donuts on the continuum with, nicotine and cocaine and so forth. And I say, look, people do get hooked on junk food. They do. And there are some people who engineer some food in order to make it highly appealing in a way that's quasi-addictive. I mean, that's been demonstrated.
Yeah, and the sugar content. Yep.
Yeah.
The science backs you up too. Yeah.
Okay, you're on an elevator for 60 seconds. It's 48 floors, but it's a pretty fast elevator, but not super fast. You're with somebody who says, I want to be a medical researcher just like you. What do you have to say to them?
So I'd say it's a very rewarding experience because one thing I always say, especially if someone has a faith background, is that we're getting to explore and understand God's creation. And in that way, it's awe-inspiring because we also continue to realize how much we don't know as we learn a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. At the same time, we do also have ways to not just have that understanding, but also translate that understanding into practice. Even in terms of that example I gave, how we think about people's behaviors, but then potentially medications or therapies that can help people move forward. So I'd say it's really rewarding from that standpoint. And it's also rewarding because it has a team component, a community component to this, because we're all working together in communities. There's mentorship that happens, there's teaching, there's education and impact in the greater community. So I would definitely propose and be a proponent of that career choice.
That's terrific. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, I have different lightning round questions every time. So I'm going to ask you, this is the first time I've ever asked anybody this question. You ready?
I'm privileged.
What was your greatest joy in the past year?
Greatest joy in the past year? Picking one. So I'd say just being back in community in a way that I hadn't been before. So about a month ago, I actually went to a conference of other addiction researchers from all over the world. The good thing was, there were a lot of precautions in place, but it was just a different energy being in the room with people again. And I think people seem to be savoring that more than they did before. So much so it's hard to break out of conversations and just having really heartfelt conversations with people who'd been through loss of loved ones and just being a source of support and encouragement, but then also celebrating things that happen in people's lives and talking about the science. So it's just really, really amazing to kind of be in that space again and to hear how much people are actually thinking more about holistic approaches to mental health, even within science realms.
That's terrific. My guest today has been Dr. Nii Addy, who is a professor and researcher at one of our nation's finest universities. It's been great to have you. And may God bless your research and your podcast. One more time, the Addy Hour. I recommend it to my listeners. Thank you.
Oh, of course. Thanks so much for having me and for this wonderful conversation and for all the work that you're doing. I know it means a lot to a lot of people.
Thank you. We're thankful for today's guest and also extend special thanks to our sponsor, the Alliance for Confessing Evangelicals. Please check out their site, Reformation 21. That's the principal host of this podcast. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.